Welcome, everyone. I think this is standing room only, which is fantastic. And of course, we know why. We have an excellent speaker who you will hear introduced in a moment, but I think it's important to note that this is the inaugural Edmund Gordon Lecture, and an important occasion for Teachers College. I want to thank Ernest Morel and the Institute for Urban and Minority Education and every other group that contributed to make this possible. So I don't think a day goes by where I don't cite or quote Ed Gordon. I think the faculty would probably agree, and it's hard not to acknowledge and realize every day how central Ed has been to this institution over so many years, and continuing to this day at the remarkable age of 92. Ed and Susan have been part of TC's history as long as anyone can remember. We couldn't imagine what we're doing in the community now with respect to addressing the whole child and all the issues of community well-being without Ed's concept of supplemental education. Our concerns about assessment, about equity, about diversity, everything we think about at TC, which is so focused on its mission of social justice, has been shaped by the thinking of Ed Gordon. He was an incredible citizen when he was here, taking on all kinds of leadership responsibilities. And as I said, he still continues to guide us in his retirement. There's no more fitting person to honor with a standing lecture series than Edmund Gordon. Wouldn't it be wonderful to endow this lecture? Yes. So we can continue it forever, and we pledge to do that, and we will be seeking resources to enable us to do that. It's just wonderful to see you both here where you belong. This is your home, and we're so pleased to celebrate you. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Ansley Erickson, Professor of History and Education.
My name is Ansley Erickson. I'm an Assistant Professor of History and Education here at Teachers College. I'm thrilled to have the privilege of introducing Charles Payne, to tell you a bit about how we came to invite him to TC, and to thank the people who made that possible. We're happy to have Dr. Payne's talk tonight included within our college-wide celebration of TC's 125th anniversary celebration, so well organized by Trish McNicholas and her colleagues. This event is also thanks to the efforts of UME and the Center on History and Education. The center was recently founded at Teachers College, endowed through a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, and with the generosity of TC alumna and trustee Sue Ann Weinberg, with Provost Tom James as acting director. I also want to thank Ruth Venz, who's chair of the Department of Arts and Humanities, and Callie Waite, my colleague in the program in History and Education, for their ongoing support for this work. Dr. Payne is here with us for this major lecture tonight, but he's also been involved in a small working conference of scholars today and tomorrow. Through a collaboration between my program in History and Education, the Institute for Urban and Minority Education, and the Center on History and Education, we have launched what we call the Educating Harlem Project. We gathered together a dynamic group of scholars coming from California, Texas, and close to home here in New York, around examining the history of education in Harlem. We want to make sure that in efforts to understand Harlem's educational present and to guide its future, we have a robust understanding of its past. We're hearing compelling new work about how Harlem's leading writers had educational as well as artistic visions. We're coming to understand better than we ever have before how changes in Harlem's physical and economic landscape happened in and around schooling. I'd like to ask our participating scholars and the graduate fellows who made the Educating Harlem Working Conference possible to stand and be recognized. Thank you all. So we have to turn to Charles Payne if we want, in the work of a single scholar, the strongest possible example of how thinking about the past is inseparable from the work of understanding the present and imagining the future. Charles Payne's scholarship has helped us identify moments when education has achieved its full liberatory potential, in the freedom schools of Mississippi or in the organizing ideas of Ella Baker. He then asks us what would happen if those educational visions could be rekindled today. He is one of those remarkable thinkers who can take something we all think we know well, the troubled history of Brown v. Board of Education, for example, and render it anew and more clearly. Charles Payne is today the Frank P. Hixon Distinguished Service Professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, having earlier held distinguished chairs and won teaching awards at Duke University and Northwestern. He earned his PhD in sociology at Northwestern. His many publications include the 1996 History of Civil Rights Organizing, I've Got the Light of Freedom, his reflections on Chicago's school reform, aptly titled So Much Reform, So Little Change, and Teach Freedom, Education for Liberation in the African American Tradition, from our own Teachers College Press. Dr. Payne has been the recipient of fellowships from the Spencer Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation, as well as serving as an Alphonse Fletcher Fellow. Charles Payne uses the term education for liberation to mean education that, in his words, helps people to think more critically about the social forces that shape our lives and think more confidently about their ability to react against those forces. I am confident that his talk tonight will move us in these directions as well. Please join me in welcoming Charles Payne.
That was a very, very nice introduction. I'm very grateful for it. I'm also grateful to Professor Morell in particular for the invitation to be here. I have to say, though, he was not entirely honest in his invitation. He did not say a word, not a mumbling word, about some kind of Ed Gordon inaugural lecture. And had he done so, I would have said I would be terribly honored to give the second Edmund Gordon lecture. But my self-image is that I'm not bothered by very much. I don't think I'm intimidated by a lot. This, frankly, does indeed intimidate me. Right? Professor Gordon is just the kind of engaged scholar that I admire most. He's the kind of teacher, the kind of mentor, the kind of involved person in the academy, and at times when the academy did not approve of that, when that was not the right way to make a career, when I grow up, he is exactly what I want to be. His scholarly work has maintained a focus on the potential of children from the social margins. When he began that work, and today, that work still runs counter to much mainstream scholarship and thinking. And that's more or less going to be my theme, a version of that. It's going to be my theme this evening. I'm going to try to do two things. I want to talk about a line of thinking about race and inequality that has really deep roots in our history. I'm absolutely positive I could have taken this talk back to the 16th or 17th century if I'd had time to play with it. I'm going to call it the thesis of the wounded Negro, right? The thesis of the wounded Negro. Then I want to talk about where that thesis of the wounded Negro, where are the contemporary manifestations of this type of thinking that has such deep roots in American history? Where are the contemporary manifestations of that in educational discourses? And what are the consequences of the manifestations of the thesis of the wounded Negro in contemporary educational discourse? That title, when I first came up with it, partly because it just happened to be reading Ralph Ellison at the time, and partly because of the conference I wanted to be able to invoke Harlem, and I was thinking about the history of that vigorous communist party, vigorous and creative communist party, and also a patronizing communist party as it existed in Harlem in the 1930s and 40s. And that language about the new Negro was intended to mock and to evoke, right? The way the Communist Party of that day thought about the relationship between race and class, all right? So, but then after I thought about it, realized, I can take this back a lot further, right? So let me go back to the 19th century, right? Let's start with the period of abolition. I'm probably especially talking about the period of abolition between roughly 1830 and 1850, right? Those of you who've studied that history know that there's a consistent tension between folks that we might think should be allies, right? Well, they were allies, right? Nevertheless, there were consistent tension between blacks and whites in the abolition movement. A tension which is going to foreshadow almost precisely in the arguments the tension between blacks and whites in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But the form that it took in the 19th century was, it centered around how black abolitionists, many of them ex-slaves, were going to be used in the movement. The overwhelming majority of white abolitionists apparently wanted ex-slaves to just tell their personal stories, to get up there on that stage and tell how horrible it had been before you were bought out or before you had. They did not want slaves doing political or theoretical analysis. They, the white abolitionists, the friends of the Negro, and I'm using that language without irony for the moment, okay? The friends of the Negro would handle the analysis part, right? The job of the Negro was just to get the emotions rolling. And of course, black speakers rebelled against that. They had their own analysis. They wanted to push the discourse in a very different direction, right? So Frederick Douglass has to go through this. Sojourner Truth has to go through this. Frederick Douglass actually goes through the limiting case of it in my mind, right? So the sort of as far as you can go. He was accused of lying about being a slave, right? Why? Because he spoke too well, right? People were saying, in effect, you haven't been wounded enough, right? You haven't been wounded enough. And we know that slaves, because they've been wounded and not allowed to develop by slavery, cannot do the kind of analysis that you do, right? Cannot use the kind of English that you do. So that's one version of it. I am going to skip, because I am already worried about time, the way in which that discourse of the wounded slave shows up in the Civil War, and then again among the missionaries coming south after the war, with an image of blacks as having been, again, not allowed to develop in slavery and being blank slates that they could tell what to do. And these are extremely well-intentioned people. Many of them are black, but they found out that slaves had their own mind, right? They had their own mind, their own direction, their own priorities. Think of the Journal of Charlotte Fortin, or if you want to read one of the standard historical versions of the Wounded Negro is Stanley Elkins, right? And his discussion of the way in which the total power imbalance between slave and slave owner meant that the slave had no choice but to internalize the values of the slave master. Anyway, that's the stuff I'm supposed to be skipping. I wanted to skip up to the Depression era and Ralph Ellison's Harlem. In his portrait of the party in Harlem in that day, it's I think widely shared among his generation of black radicals, who saw the party, and by the way, while this is a critique of the party, I was reminded by some of the papers I heard this afternoon that there is really another side of the party, a side that really was genuinely progressive, a side, and the papers that I was listening to this afternoon had to do with party-influenced members of the teachers' union of the time and how hard they fought to make a difference for the children in Harlem. So there is another side from the side that Ralph Ellison talked about. But he talked about a pattern in which black intellectuals would be drawn into the party and then consistently disappointed in it, right? At first, it looks like they have a different kind of egalitarianism, a new level of resources, deep level of commitment. But it turns out that all of that comes with a price, right? That the more Ellison's protagonist gets into the party leaders, the more patronizing they seem. The more, while they are very comfortable letting Negroes be the face of the party in Negro communities, they're not very comfortable with Negroes shaping theory or shaping policy. The policy that the party saw raced through the prism of an abstract ideology in a way that made it impossible for them to see Negroes as real people, a point that Ellison made over again. Negroes get reduced to a sympathetic category. The oppressed, with capital letters, the workers writ large. So Ellison's protagonist remains as invisible to Brother Jack as to anyone else, right? Human complexity gets lost, even in the context of this sympathetic theory, and underlying the way in which the party thought about the role of its black members is again the idea that they haven't been developed enough to play the role of theorists, of policymakers. They haven't been exposed to the scientific analysis of society that Marxism represents, and therefore they can be tokens. I think some of you will recall this quote from Ellison. It comes in the context of his critique of Myrdal, which is another wounded Negro thesis. Ellison: prefabricated Negroes are sketched on sheets of paper and superimposed upon the Negro community. Then when someone thrusts his head through the page and yells, "Watch out, Jack, there are people living under here," they are shocked and indignant. I suspect, too, that one of the reasons that Ellison, in my head, Invisible Man, goes out of his way to demonstrate that among the simple people of Harlem, right, among the uneducated of Harlem, you can find complex analysis, as complex social understanding as you can in Marxist theory, right, from people who are selling sweet potatoes and renting rooms. I think there's a reason he makes that defense of what folk culture can do as his kind of response to the thesis of the wounded, of the wounded Negro. But my point is that it's clear that in the eyes of Ellison and many of his generation, the friends of the Negro reduced black people to their underdevelopment, reduced them to their oppression. Let's jump ahead to the period I sort of know best, the 1960s, specifically 1964. I'm mentioning this in part because this year coming will be the 50th anniversary of the Mississippi Summer Project. There'll be all kinds of commemorations of it. That project was essentially aimed at the unwillingness of the governments of this country at any level to protect the lives of Negroes who were fighting for the right to vote. The project brought nearly 900 mostly white people to the state. I tried to look up the number who came from Columbia, and I couldn't find it quickly enough. But of course, the one name that sort of resonated above all was Mickey Schwerner, right, who was in the sociology department here before he went to Mississippi, from which obviously he never returned. But brought nearly 900 mostly white people to the state, knowing that if they came, the protection of the country would come with them. And so it proved out. The country played out its role flawlessly, consistently acting very differently when white life was taken from the way it had reacted over many years when black life was taken. It was absolutely a turning point in the history of this country, in the history of activism in this country, in the history of white-black relationships among activists in this country. And it seemed ironic to a great many at the time that in that context of the movement, where everybody was putting his or her life on the line, where you had the best and the brightest, the most moral of young Americans, white and black, fighting for the same goal, that in the end they could not get along, right? In the end, by the end of that summer, right, you had really high levels of visible racial tension inside the movement, especially among the younger folk in the movement. Well, when you look at it more soberly, I don't know if any of you guys know the Marx and Hixon article, Majority Involvement in Minority Movements. For anybody who is concerned with this issue, right, of crossing these kinds of boundaries, it's probably the best framing of the issue. And he says, nope, that this is the historical pattern. These things almost never are stable over time. These things in which, quote, outsiders try to make a contribution to another, Gandhi trying to help the untouchable movement. That's an unstable situation. Sooner or later, they will put him out, right? The process as it played out in Mississippi in the summer of 1964, it actually turns out that they didn't have exactly the same goals. They had overlap, that is the young black folk in the movement and the young white folk in the movement. To some degree, as much as they wanted to change the edifice of white supremacy, which I'm not doubting at all, a great many of the white volunteers were also seeking a kind of moral validation for themselves. They were acquiring a kind of moral merit badge by associating themselves with the dispossessed. Overlapping with that, there's an enormous difference between people who wish to contribute to change and people who wish to get credit for leading change, right? And did I not say that the movement made a deliberate point of recruiting as many people as possible, not just from white colleges, but from elite white colleges, right? They bring a certain self-definition of themselves as people who are entitled to lead. And that's certainly not everybody. It's certainly enough to make trouble. And by the way, if you look at the end of what I think is the best film on Freedom Summer, when some of the folk who were interviewed, who maybe 40 years after the summer, and they're looking back with the wisdom of 40 years at what they were when they were 20 or 21, some of the white volunteers give this critique of themselves, right, of who they were, right? So it's not much controversial. Stop me if you heard this story before. When you think of Black Power, you think of male names. Columbia's own Professor Hamilton, Rap Brown, Stutter Carmichael. In point of fact, as Black Power thinking evolved inside of SNCC, there were a group of extremely powerful Black women who were involved in working out the theoretical rationale, right? So this is one more of those cases in which some of the groundwork is being done by women and the public sees men, right? One of them, she wrote that remarkably influential paper, the Atlanta Project Position Paper on Race, right? It was a paper which 1966, saying that whites have had too visible and too central a role in our movement, and then laying out the theoretical rationale for Black Power, right? The primary drafter of that was a young woman from Memphis, Zahara Simmons. She'd been in the movement in '64. She'd probably been in 2 years. Her family had more or less kicked her out. Doggone it, girl, if you go down there and get yourself killed, we'll throw you out of the family. You know, that kind of expulsion. And when you talk to Zahara about what had moved her to that position, right? It was being a movement veteran in 1964, right? It was knowing the South, knowing racism at a really intimate level, being appointed a project director for some county in Mississippi, and getting a whole lot of white males from Ivy League schools and from Stanford who treated her like she was the wallpaper, right? Because she did not have their language, she did not have their theory, she did not have their style. And so the idea of taking orders, of being led by an uneducated Black woman from a Black college, Spelman. Do you know what I'm saying? You know, there'd be a different sensitivity right now, right? But they didn't even think at that time there was anything wrong, right? It was that level of entitlement that they brought with them. The fact that they are against racism in some forms doesn't mean they aren't carriers of racism in other forms, right? Without intending it, without... And the other point which runs through these little stories is that a great many of them came to Mississippi with a notion that Negroes were so wounded, were so limited by the experience of racism and poverty in Mississippi, that they, the outsiders, were coming as saviors. That what they were there to do was to sort of analyze the situation and tell people what to do. And consistently in their records, you get this. I'm surprised at how much, not exactly this way, how much intelligence there is in these communities, how much courage there is in this community, how much they have done before we even got here. They're coming again, like the missionaries after Reconstruction, looking for empty vessels, people who have been wounded by the nature of racism. Now, obviously, I just want to point out here before that the Friends of the Negro are not above trading on Negro suffering in ways which give them license. License to speak, license to lead, license to interpret, right? I also want to point out that there was a real obvious reductionist quality to this, right? Black people are being reduced to their oppression. Like there's nothing else going on in their lives except what white people have done to them, right? And in some of these cases, there's a kind of symbolic exploitation in that the Friends of the Negro are using the Negro woundedness as a weapon in some other fight. Wounded Negroes become a club to beat some enemy down. And often they're enemies that need to be beaten down. Right? Nevertheless, there's a kind of symbolic exploitation of this. Well, now I want to sort of step out of the role of speaker and step into the role of sociologist analyzing what Charles Payne has just done, and the kind of rhetorical corner into which I have painted myself here, right? Because obviously I did it, so I had reasons for doing it, but I'm also ambivalent about what I've just done. That is to say, I've just constructed an intimidating moral edifice, right? I sort of built up this case against the friends of the Negro. I don't think there's anybody right now in this audience who's likely to volunteer to join that club as I have just described it, right? And now the logic of academic discourse is that having built the edifice up, I now have to push somebody off that edifice, right? I mean, you know, otherwise there's no end to the talk, right? So academic ritual demands that I do that, and then the implication that I am ambivalent about is the implication that the modern carriers of the dread disease of the thesis of the wounded Negro share all of the moral infirmities of their predecessors, right? And what I want to say, and the reason that I deliberately ended with this, do it that way. The reason I deliberately ended with the summer of '64 is that I can say that I personally know a lot of those people, the students who went south. And they are among the human beings that I admired most, right? I meant to say that I admire most now. And I know that some of them were obtuse, arrogant, that their idealism was mixed with elitism, that they were in their own way carriers of various forms of racism. But that is just to say that they are products of a living history, just like the rest of us, right? Within that history, within what could be reasonably expected of them, they probably did more than could be reasonably expected of them, right? I don't think Mrs. Hamer's comment, Fannie Hamer had a trenchant critique of those kids, right? Especially around this notion of they're coming down there and treating her like she couldn't think, right? She also had that Mrs. Hamer's humanism, you know? Everybody's a child of God. Some people forget it sometimes, right? And so her comment, when somebody was going on about those kids this and those kids that, those kids, did they share in Mississippi, right? Again, not denying, not arguing that they were perfect, but what they did mattered in that time and in that place. So what I am trying to say then is that I have constructed this edifice to make rhetorically the point that the ideas that I think I'm going to talk about, where the wounded Negro shows up in contemporary discourse, I think are powerfully undermining, are powerfully and deeply destructive. But I also want to make it really clear, I'm talking about a set of ideas. I am not talking about the people. Some of the people who express these ideas, some of these people are good friends of mine. Some of my best friends have the wounded Negroes as their best friends or something like that. I want to make a distinction between the people, right, and the ideas. And there are some ideas which are floating around here, which are being taken for granted and which are acceptable in academic discourse that I think are utterly disgusting, right, in the same way that history of ideas. And so let me note, too, that I think it's clear I have no doubt that racism and poverty cannot just be wounding, cannot just be limiting. In some cases, it can be crippling, right? What I'm arguing is that is one dynamic in the life of a child, or one dynamic in the life of a you have to ask, what else is there, right? Is it impossible for oppressed communities to defend their children all the damn time? Can they defend some of their children, or are they all wounded, right? I mean, that's the issue. I understand. I don't think let me stay on that. Before you see, I can't lose my temper on this stuff, right? You should have seen the original version of this talk. And also want to clarify that there are various black versions of the thesis of the wounded Negro. This is the version in which I'm talking about really is, right now, at this point in time, predominantly being expressed by white scholars. Right? No, not entirely, but predominantly, right? But I know that there are various black versions. So anyway, we come to the question now. after a century and a half of racial discourse, where in contemporary American discourse do we find the wounded Negroes? Where are they hiding, right? Do you have one under your seat, perhaps? Now, if this were the 1970s, this would be easy. Because in the 1970s, again, we had a different set of cultural sensibilities. It was right out there in front, right? Cultural deprivation. All right. Probably the default explanation among sociologists for a lack of achievement in minority communities, right? Their culture handicaps them, right? They can't defer gratification. Culture of poverty. You had all of that language, right? And then you had James Coleman, right? Which gets interpreted as it's all about the family, right? It's all about the families that they come from. But the question then is where is the modern version of the thesis of the wounded Negro, right? What's the form? And it seems to me that the form of it with which I am most familiar and with which I am most concerned is the contemporary argument, which is expressed in its simplest way: schools can't do it alone, right? Schools can't do it alone. What inner city kids go through, what poverty does to children and families, is so blah, 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 that blah, 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 right? It is an argument about the impotence of schooling. And again, I'm trying to emphasize that when we first get that argument, it's coming from folk, from the functional theory of stratification, from Eric Hanushek, as he would have been 20 years ago, because Eric Hanushek sings a real different song now from what he sang a few years ago. It's coming from people often that we consider conservative, sometimes outright right? But one form of the argument becomes, in those days, poverty overwhelms the capacity of schools to do anything, and therefore, spending more money on them will do no good, right? And of course, that falls right in line with traditional conservative thinking about wasting money on poor people. By the way, the last book with a title that I can find, Does Money Matter?, is put out by the Brookings Institute, real respectable. Every educational economist you can think of, Dick Murnane, Hanno Scheck, they're all there and they're debating this issue: does money matter in the schooling of poor children, right? They didn't say that, but that's what they mean. Nobody ever asked, does money matter for middle-class kids, right? That is just assumed, right? It is only other people's children who get problematized this way. That book was published in 1996, 18 years ago, right? At that point, we were still debating whether schools could have impact, whether teachers could have impact, and whether money mattered in any of that, right? The discourse has changed that much in a few years. But at that point, I am trying to say, you had the right, using it in the most general and inexact sense, arguing that poverty was so wounding that schools could do nothing in its face, right? Now we have progressives making the same kind of argument, framing it differently, much more sympathetically. But you know, to me, it just seems to be bizarre to be living at a moment when conservatives, who historically own the narratives of minority inferiority, are saying the kids are fine, the parents are fine, if we could just get rid of these goddamn unions, right? While progressives are saying, now we got to fix poverty before we can fix schools. Right? It just seems somehow like the world's standing on its head when you see how the shift has taken. I'm going to take one widely, let me just out of curiosity, the report, Rhetoric Trumps Reality from the Bigger and Bolder Approach. How many of you have seen that? Yeah, it got pretty wide in circulation. I think it came out in sometime this spring. But an analysis of a critique, and a very thoughtful and in many ways, a very useful paper, but a critique of corporate reform, focusing on 3 cities, New York City being one of them. And again, I'm not concerned with the larger paper in which I find a lot of value, but I'm concerned with this argument from them, literally. Reforms fail when they ignore poverty-related causes of achievement. I repeat, reforms fail when they ignore the poverty-related causes of achievement. And then they elaborate on that idea, right, which could have come from Coleman, if we had reforms in his day. They elaborate on the idea in clearly sympathetic, I would say non-victim blaming ways. Children growing up with limited resources, being raised by poorly educated parents, impede students' development and academic achievement. In a kindergarten, exacerbated by gaps, larger achievement gaps exist when they enter kindergarten. They are exacerbated by gaps in nutrition and health status, health care that divide along lines of race and class, differential learning after school programs over the summer hours. And every bit of that is true, right? Every bit of that is true. None of that speaks to the assertion that they made. Not a word of that speaks to their assertion. We can all agree that poverty should be addressed. I think that's a great idea. It should be central on the national agenda. That has nothing at all to do with what schools can or cannot do. That's a separate set of data that you need to answer that question, and they simply do not adduce that kind of data. Let me illustrate one of the reasons. One kind of alternative, I guess you can say that. These days, everybody and their mother is interpreting NAEP data to mean all kinds of things. So let me give you my interpretation of NAEP. I'm going to talk about proficiency data on NAEP. You guys probably know proficiency on NAEP is considered to be a quite high bar. It is not you're doing okay, right? It correlates to about a 25 on the ACT. These are kids that we think are going to be okay academically if the other things in their lives are halfway right. So it's a high bar, and part of I'm absolutely convinced that one of the reasons we can't understand inner city schools is that most of our bars are inverted metrics. They're really, really low standards, right? And when you talk about this using low standards, it's harder, I think, to get clarity. So anyway, give me a second. I'm trying to figure out my time. Okay, I'm going to skip some things. I don't think most folk in education are aware of this. That if you look at NAEP over about a 15-year period from the middle 90s to the last, and if you look at young children in math, we have tripled the number of kids who are in proficient or advanced, the number of low-income children in proficient or advanced. We have more than cut in half the category you don't want kids in, that below basic category, right? It seems to me we should have had a national discussion about what the heck happened, right? Somebody did something right, or maybe the kids changed. Whatever it is, we need to get some handle on it, right? That's a discussion we have never had, to my knowledge, right? What we have had, and the other slides that I skipped, are about waiting for Superman, which takes out all the negative data it can find for NAEP, and it presents that, right? But trying to disentangle what this is, no, I don't. Instead, we get a discourse about firing as many teachers as we can. Again, these are the numbers represent, and given districts of the 21 districts nationally that we have this kind of data for, the proportion of young students. When I started doing this work, I thought it made sense to start with young students for various strategic reasons. I might argue with myself now. But all I'm concerned with, and I'm not making any claims about what's driving this, all I'm saying is we don't know what the hell is driving it, right? And these numbers are just enormous. To say that in Tampa, fourth grade students overall at 44% of them reached the level of proficiency. And in Detroit, Cleveland, Fresno, Baltimore, you don't get up to 10, right? If you look at, I don't know what we got next week. Proficiency in math, you get a group that are beating the nation, where the nation's average is 39%. You have 3 cities, and be careful, this chart should have had an asterisk around all the places that are city-county districts. I think there are like 6 of them. Like it's Hillsborough, Tampa, it's Miami-Dade, and Charlotte, Mecklenburg, right? So in a way, you need to separate that out. But nonetheless, however you do it, it's the range that I am concerned with, right? And whatever may be driving that range. So if you look just at low-income students, as best as we can measure them, a closer test. First of all, and I know how you doggone radicals like to attack the school system in New York. I kind of enjoy it too, to tell you the truth. Nevertheless, on this measure, when you get away from the scale scores and look at who is over proficiency, New York looks good compared to the other cities in which we have data. Right? Compared. And then the Cleveland, Milwaukee, Fresno, Detroit group. No matter which slide you look at, you get that group hanging at the end. Math are kind of similar. Boston at the end, and then our usual friends. I'm not. Oh, you know what? No, we're gonna skip that. I better skip that. All I'm trying to say is that we have wide variation on a performance metric that we actually think matters. Unlike most of our discussions about test scores, we have good reason to think that getting over this hurdle says something about the probability of kids having a better life, right? And on that metric, some systems have changed. There has been some national change. And I'm certainly not saying that these are all system effects, that New York is doing something better. It may well be that New York just has better kids. It may well be a difference in the economy. It may well be differences in the character of segregation. It may well be differences in how poverty, it may well be differences in the nature of poverty. All of those things, right? But I don't know that and you don't know that, right? What we know is that there is wide variation. And so long as we don't know what's driving this, it is insane to say schools can't do it. It's just past belief that none of those variations have to do with what school systems can do. Until we can come up with some kind of validated estimates of what part of these variations can be attributed to the thinking and the actions of school leaders, we don't need to be assuming that only the reforms that directly address poverty matter, right? To go back to my straw man. Let me give you one other kind of example. A consortium of Chicago School of Research maybe 2 years ago did a study of students of average achievement, I think all of them African American or Latino, certainly overwhelmingly African American Latino, who are given access to strong IB programs, right? And it turns out that compared to match comparison group students and IB programs, students of average achievement, what I'm saying, right? Kids who almost never get access to that kind of program, right? 40%, I said 40%, more likely to attend a four-year college, 50% more likely to attend selective colleges. And most of you know minority students in particular. The more selective the college you go to, the more likely you are to graduate. Right? You undermatch, you're more likely to go right back home. 40%, 50%, how often do we see those kinds of impacts, right? And this kind of research. I have trouble actually thinking of another case. And they're also significantly more likely to persist in colleges at least through the first 2 years, which is when the study was done. Now, I'm saying those are enormous impacts compared to what we normally get. If you begin with the notion of school impotence in the face of how poverty wounds children, you can't get to that data. You can't get to a data of what is possible for kids if they get the best teaching we can give them, if they get academic rigor, if they get signals from authoritative people about what their potential might be, right? You can't get to that discussion if you stop at the discussion of the wounded poor people, right? To take it. In my head, I know this is controversial, that's why I'm saying it, I guess. You know, the small schools of choice in New York, and the way in which they're pushing both high school graduation and college readiness. And I know, for some kids, right? I get that part. I know there's a controversy about what these numbers mean, right? But that's another kind of story that's similar. I was actually going to walk you through one of my favorite stories, and one I think is often misunderstood, the Montgomery County, Maryland story, right? Where I think the change is extremely real in that county, extremely deep. I think Boston, as a city, is becoming this kind of story. But we cannot get to these kinds of stories. These kinds of stories will never get the attention that they ought to get if we keep focusing on what schools cannot do, right? I don't, well, you know, the retort to what I'm saying, Some of you, I'm thinking, who have studied Marx or are sitting there pushing back at what I'm saying, the system can work for a few, and that helps to legitimate the whole wheel, but at some point the system is going to push back. You may well be right. I can't argue that, but what I do know is that Marx is not data. We don't know. We don't know how many kids can be absorbed in this system, and that's especially true given the state of globalization that we are. I'm willing to accept it has to be in the class. Not clear to me it has to be my kids. I'll say it just up bluntly, right? It's not clear to me, right? I'll leave that there. So anyway, I want to respect the idea of the interdependence of schools and the economy and the polity. That doesn't mean that we have to make any assumptions or that we're entitled without data to make any assumptions about when those relationships are going to become determinative. That's another argument. I know I'm going to finish up in two. I'm not even going to give you examples. This is a reductionist discourse. It's a discourse which talks as if every kid in a ghetto school is the same as every other kid in a ghetto school, right? Some kids need the Marine Corps to get help, right? Some kids need one more positive adult in their life 15 minutes a week. Because the communities are giving them almost everything they need to get over, right? Almost everything. And then they want the best data for this. We finally figured out that if you help kids, it looks to me like if you make a serious effort to get kids to fill out the FAFSA form, you get a 10% pump in your college going rate, right? That means those kids were there, they were ready, they were almost over. It came to something that their families could not help them with. It is not anything all that difficult. It doesn't require all that many resources. And if we do that, we get a 10. I think that group of kids who are in our schools and underserved but almost ready, it's got to be I think it's somewhere between 10 and 20%. But the point I'm trying to make is we talk about this thing as if there's some average ghetto child, and the average ghetto child needs all these impossibly expensive and unreachable resources. We don't think about the range of needs and the range of supports that kids already have. I'm going to make this last point, then the rest of it we're just going to skip. One of the many reasons that I'm offended by this discourse is that on the one hand it's empirically sloppy, on the other hand it's conceptually sloppy. And part of the conceptual sloppiness is around this notion of what does it mean for schools to do something? What people seem to be thinking when they talk about what schools can or cannot do, the framework is about teaching, it's about governance, sometimes about resources, sometimes about organization, right? It is not a social analysis of schools, right? It does not take into account the fact that a great many poor children and students of color and their parents don't experience schools as welcoming or supportive places, right? What they experience is a kind of racialized disdain and sometimes institutionalized degradation. And before we can talk about, in any sensible way, about what schools can or cannot do, we need to figure out what happens when schools systematically make an effort to make kids feel that they belong, make kids feel that they're valued. Unless we have done that at some kind of scale, I don't know how we can say what we know about what schools can and cannot do. So, I don't want time for questions. I know I've gone on over long. Just let me say, this doctrine about the impotence of schools in the face of poverty is ideologically dangerous. It drifts too close to narratives of race and capacity that have a bad history. It's empirically flimsy. It's often based on misinterpreting the same data that the right misinterprets to justify charter schools and the like. It's morally compromised because it reduces poor children to an uninformed caricature of oppression. It takes away from poor children the complexity and the vulnerability that we all see in our own children. It is politically obtuse because it seems unlikely that we can retain the allegiance of poor communities by telling them to wait for the revolution. And I want to question again, sincerely, I am questioning no one's motives, right? In one sense, what I am saying is that people are underestimating the power of this country's master narrative about race and the power of that narrative to turn other narratives to its account, right, to use them. Then beyond that, I feel so strongly about this, if you had not noticed, because I believe strongly that oppressed people survive by seeing a future for their children that can't be derived from the facts that are around them, right? That can't be derived from present circumstances. You really have to believe that there's a balm in Gilead. So emphasizing what schools can't do before we have any clarity about what schools can do dishonors the teachers and the principals who are changing lives, often at significant cost to themselves, the parents and communities who are supporting children, often at significant cost to themselves. It insults the generations of people who insisted on making a way out of nowhere, right? So I guess I can stop with that and see if perhaps there are any comments, any questions, or perhaps here somebody might wish to disagree with me. So, who first? Please.
I'm also from Chicago.
Cool.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the school closings that just occurred. They closed 50 some schools in Chicago.
54.
And specifically, you just mentioned charter schools, the increase in opening charter schools after closing those community schools.
Okay. Now, some of this is speculation, all right, but the latter, but I can tell you what I think and what I know. My opinion was that the way in which, and I'm not in principle against closing schools, the way in which the process was done was consistently alienating for most community leaders and activists, right? And the irony is that 3 or 4 years ago, some folk began a process in Chicago in which they went into communities and they said, look, in Inglewood, come up with an Inglewood plan for the schools. What do you want open? What do you want closed? Thinking about 10 years. Think about the whole lifespan of children. Then come back to us, right? That initiative, had we paid attention to it, Baltimore did something like this, right? Had we paid attention to it, I really think would have led to a very different kind of process. But this was done in a hurry. It excluded people who were concerned. You know, I sort of, the data that they used to make decisions on was, in the schools, you know, where I'm closest, in the schools that I work in, the data that they presented as a rationale for closing one school and opening another school, it was embarrassing, right? It was just that bad, right? A 1/10 of a point difference on a test that we know does not predict anything about a kid's life. And you say, on that basis, we're going to close this one and open that. So again, it's not for me. It was not done well, right? 2, I'm pretty sure that what is going to happen when you look back 5 years from now, some of those empty buildings, a significant number of those empty buildings will have charter schools in them, right? And the Board of Education will not do it, right? It will come from proxies. It won't be done directly. It's my prediction. Sir?
I'm a first-year master's student here at TC, and I'm coming from a charter school in DC as a 3-year teacher. And the lecturer was a lot about what schools can do. And as a teacher, I understand, in a sense, the possibilities of the school. But I'm here to ask you, what do schools want to do? Because as someone who's on more of a leadership team at the school that I worked at in DC, it seemed to be the case that though we work for having equality and making sure that excellence was one of our goals, I'm not sure if that's the intended purpose of schools. So my question to you is, again, what is the purpose of school? Is that what schools want to happen, equality and excellence?
Is that what schools want to have happen?
Yes, you said what can schools do, but is that what schools want to do?
There's no simple answer to that for me. The thing that I am most convinced about is what parents in urban areas want, because they're really clear, and you get the same story. I want a child who can compete economically. I want a child who has good moral values, who has good character. I want a child who's attached to this community, right? That part's clear, and I think what schools should be doing, trying to produce the kind of kids that parents want, and they should be doing that in partnership with them. Schools are, of course, political entities, and so all kinds of other cross purposes come into play. But that's what they should be doing.
But didn't the Coleman report and the Montgomery report speak to the fact that families and cultural boundaries necessarily don't value education the same way that some other families and communities do value?
Well, you had to go there, huh? Complicated answer. Those of you should look at an article that Isabel Sawhill at Brookings just published about Moynihan Revisited, in which she's saying, you know what? The white family in 2013 has worse statistics than the black families Moynihan talked about in 1966. Now, what does that mean for our national understanding? I think that's a very important discussion. And I actually think that one of the ways in which, I'm going to put it in a narrow and personal, we black intellectuals and intellectuals of the left messed up we spent so much time attacking Moynihan's scholarship, and God knows it was shaky, right? And compare his analysis of the black family to Herbert Gutman's analysis of the black family, right? There's just no comparison, right? But you know, I'll bet you nobody who in this audience can tell me what Moynihan's main policy recommendation was? One hand, can I get one hand? This is Columbia, damn it. All right, there is a hand. It was twice a day mail delivery in the cities, because you could create a cadre of jobs for a generation of men who only had high school education or even less, right? That was a damn sensible recommendation 50 years ago, right? It wouldn't be a bad idea now, right? But he said, put these people to work at jobs with benefits and security. We never discussed that. Why? Because we got all caught up into this image of the politics of image and responsibility, and into a notion of ourselves as scholars that our job is to burnish the image of the poor. And we did not push that argument at a time when Johnson probably had the power to make this damn thing happen, right? He probably had that power. We did not push that. So in part, I am looking at these young folk and saying, and because I know this is a socially committed group, and I really want you to think what social commitment means for a scholar, and especially for scholars of color and scholars who identify, for whatever reasons, with subordinated communities, right? And this notion that the totality of our responsibility is to play these politics of image games, I think is enormously destructive. That said, we have to rethink. If you ask me what role families play in the most impressive school reforms in this country, I will say marginal. Boston is not being driven by families. Montgomery County is not being driven by families. I know. I'll finish on.
Yeah, we'll take one more after this.
Okay, good. Montgomery County is not being driven by families. If you ask me what I think is the potential of families to play a larger role, I think it is incredible. I mean, in Chicago, we have some of the best parent organizing in this country, right? And I've seen schools go from 80% of the parents on board to 60, 70% of the parents on board, right? It is a doable thing when parents get support. But if you think of them as wounded, and we have to make excuses for why they don't come to school, as opposed to figuring out what supports that person needs, right? We never get to that. I'll just leave that there. Now it's a good question.
Sir, we don't have time for many more questions. I want to do two things before people run out. I want to thank Professor Payne in a moment. I want to have a tribute for Professor Gordon. I just want to say about this man who gave the talk today. When I first came and took the directorship of UME, I knew one of the things that I wanted to do was to create an endowed lectureship for Professor Gordon, I'll talk about in a second. There's a very short list of people in my mind whose careers and whose lives outside of the academy were worthy of being associated with the inaugural Edmund Gordon address. And the person at the very top of that list was Charles Payne, for all of the reasons that you saw in this talk. So please join me in thanking him so much for sharing. I'll be quick because
If I can
lean on this. You can lean on this. So when I think of the luminaries in the 125-year history of Teachers College, and I was limited to one hand to name those people, Professor Gordon would be one of those people. Like, what he has done for the field
right? What he has done for this college, what he did in starting the Institute for Urban and Minority Education and all the other things that he has done. You can talk about the methodological dexterity, right? You can talk about the number of fields in which he's an expert. You can talk about the number of people that he has mentored and been, I think as Veronica, our assistant director, said, a legend to. One of the things I think that is the most key contribution across those fields, I feel like Professor Gordon is as responsible as anyone for seriously reframing the way we have thought about the young people we teach, the families they come from, the neighborhoods that they live in. Not as deficits, but as possibilities, right? What would it mean to think about a group differently? That was the main theme of Professor Payne's talk, right? You change your perception, all kinds of different things become possible, right? So that is the gift that he's given us over 65 years as an intellectual, as an advocate, as a mentor, as a professor, as a scholar, as a director, as an administrator. So this is the least that we could do to thank him for the legacy that he has left, but also the challenge that he leaves us to seriously think about the questions that we ask when we do research, to seriously think about what our preconceived notions are of the possible. 65 years and counting of service to the field, to the profession, to the college.
Thank you, folks. I won't say much. Veronica and Ernest had me meeting with some students earlier, and they promised me I wouldn't have to talk, so I'm not going to say. But I would like to say thank you to Teachers College, and thank you to so many of you and many of you who are not here, who have made the journey for me so rewarding. And perhaps the best reward for my effort and my wife's companionship in trying to make our contributions, probably the best thing is people like our speaker tonight and my successor as director of UMI, and about 75 to 100 other young scholars like them. It's worth living to 93 to be able to see it. Thank you.